Somewhere in Loudoun County, Virginia, a woman opens an envelope from her power company and does a double take. The number at the bottom is higher than last month, higher than the month before that, and higher if she goes back and checks than almost any month in her adult life. She didn't run the air conditioner any harder, she didn't buy a new appliance. Nothing in her house changed. But 3 miles down the road something did change. A long, low building went up behind a chain-link fence, windowless, humming faintly even from the road, with a name on the sign that means nothing to her and a purpose she couldn't tell you if you asked. It's a data center, one of thousands now spreading across the country, built to run the artificial intelligence tools that write emails, generate images, and answer questions in half a second. She has probably used one of those tools herself this week, maybe today, and now she's starting to wonder if she's also paying for it twice. She's not alone in wondering. Surveys taken in the past year found that a large majority of Americans are worried, specifically, that new data centers are pushing their electricity bills up. In places where the buildings are thickest, Northern Virginia most of all, that worry hardens into something closer to certainty. Voters there, by wide margins, now blame the facilities down the road for what's happening to their utility bills. Whether that blame is entirely fair is one of the questions this story is going to sit with honestly, because the honest answer turns out to be more complicated and more interesting than either side of the argument wants it to be. But the fact that so many people have arrived at the same suspicion, independently in different states, is itself worth taking seriously. Something is moving money around in this country quietly at a scale most people have never had to think about before. This is an attempt to trace where it's going. To understand who's really paying, you first have to understand what you're paying for, and it isn't what most people picture when they hear data center. Say the words and a lot of people imagine a big office building full of computers, not that different from a corporate headquarters, just with more air conditioning. That image is a couple of decades out of date. What's being built right now in dozens of American counties, in industrial parks and cornfields and old coal country, is something else entirely. Physical infrastructure on the scale of a power plant, purpose-built for a very specific, very hungry job, training and running artificial intelligence models. Think about what it actually takes to make an AI system respond to you in real time. Somewhere, a physical object has to do the calculating. Not one object, tens of thousands of them, specialized computer chips called GPUs, racked floor to ceiling in windowless halls, running continuously day and night, 12 months a year at a pace and density that ordinary office computing never approached. Each one of those chips draws serious electrical power and throws off serious heat. And when you multiply that by tens of thousands of chips packed into a single building, you get a facility that doesn't behave like an office building at all. It behaves like an industrial plant. A single one of these hyperscale campuses, and hyperscale has become the industry's own word for the new, oversized category, can draw as much continuous electricity as a small city. Some of the newest ones, the ones tech companies are racing each other to finish first, are being planned to eventually draw as much power as a mid-sized metropolitan area, all by themselves, running around the clock. And all of that computing heat has to go somewhere. Traditional data centers cooled their equipment mostly with air conditioning, the same basic physics as cooling any building, just done at industrial scale. But the density of modern AI hardware runs so hot that air alone often isn't enough. So many of the newest facilities cool their chips with water, sometimes evaporating millions of gallons of it a day, run through the building and lost to the atmosphere as steam, not returned to the local water system. A single large facility can use, on a daily basis, more water than several thousand households combined. Multiply that by the scale of the current build-out, thousands of data centers now operating in the United States, with over 1,000 more either under construction or already approved, and you start to see why local water utilities that were built and sized decades ago for very different assumptions about demand, are having urgent, sometimes public, conversations about whether they can actually supply what's being asked of them. Here's the thing that makes this economically strange, though, and it's worth sitting with for a second before we go any further. None of this, the electricity, the water, the enormous physical footprint, is a side effect of what these companies do. It's the product. When Amazon, Google, Meta, Microsoft, or a newer entrant like XAI builds a data center, they are not building a place to store your files or run a website. Increasingly, they are building the physical engine room for artificial intelligence itself, the thing that makes the AI product possible to sell at all. And they are pouring an almost unfathomable amount of money into building that engine room as fast as they possibly can, because in this race, being early with more computing capacity than your competitor isn't a nice advantage. Multiple executives at these companies have said, plainly in public earnings calls, that the greater risk right now isn't spending too much on this infrastructure, it's spending too little and falling behind. That single strategic belief more than any other factor explains why so much is being built, so fast, in so many places, often before the local systems around them. The power grid, the water utility, the tax code, the zoning board have had time to catch up. Which brings us back to that envelope and that number at the bottom of it. Because when a company decides that building faster matters more than almost anything else, someone still has to answer a much older, much more boring question. Who pays for the poles, the wires, the water pipes, and the power plants that make all of that speed physically possible? The tech company writing the check for the chips inside the building is not, it turns out, always the same entity writing the check for what happens outside it. And once you start pulling on that thread, who actually pays for the electricity system upgrade? Who actually pays for the water? Who actually pays later when the tax breaks that lured the building there in the first place come due? The picture gets a lot less abstract and a lot closer to home. Start with the electricity because that's where the money question is most direct and also where it gets most genuinely disputed. Here's the mechanism, stripped down to its basics. The American power grid isn't one single machine, it's split into regional systems, each managed by a grid operator that has to make sure supply and demand stay balanced, second by second, or the lights go out. Some of these regions, especially the one covering the Mid-Atlantic and parts of the Midwest, called PJM, have seen data center demand arrive faster than almost anyone forecasted even a few years ago. And when demand for electricity grows faster than the supply of it, prices in the wholesale market, the market where utilities buy the power they then resell to you, tend to rise. PJM runs an annual auction where power generators bid to guarantee they'll have capacity available a few years out, and in one recent auction, the clearing price didn't rise gradually. It jumped nearly tenfold in a single year, from under $30 per megawatt day to close to $270. PJM itself pointed to several causes at once: tighter supply, new market rules, plants retiring, but independent energy analysts, in reports prepared for consumer advocates, singled out data center growth as one of the significant drivers behind that spike specifically in this region. That capacity market price increase doesn't stay contained to the wholesale side. It flows, eventually, into the rate cases utilities file with state regulators, asking permission to charge customers more, and those filings have been arriving at a pace state commissions haven't seen before. In just the first 3 months of 2026, utility companies asked regulators nationwide to approve rate increases totaling over $9 billion. That followed a full year, 2025, in which the total request came to $31 billion, more than double what utilities had asked for the year before that. Crucially, close to half of those 2025 requests hadn't even been approved yet by early 2026, which means a meaningful chunk of the increase working its way toward household bills right now was already locked into the pipeline before anyone reading this saw the impact land in their own mailbox. Analysis from congressional economists found Americans spent, on average, about $110 more on electricity in 2025 than the year before, and that was measured before the backlog of pending rate cases had even finished clearing. So when someone in Northern Virginia says their bill has gone up because of the data centers down the road, they are pointing at something real: a documented chain of cause and effect running from data center electricity demand, through the wholesale capacity market, into the rate cases utilities file, and out the other end as a bigger number on a household bill. A Harvard Law School energy researcher, co-author of one of the studies tracing this exact chain, has walked through precisely this mechanism as one of the clearer ways new data centers can push up what a household pays, even though the household itself never asked for any of that new electrical capacity to be built. And this is where honesty about uncertainty matters. That is not the whole national picture, and treating it as the whole picture would be its own kind of dishonesty. Independent modeling looking specifically at how much of the recent, broader run-up in American electricity prices can be pinned on data centers arrives at a much more mixed answer. Retail electricity prices have climbed nearly 40% nationally since 2021, the fastest sustained run-up in modern record-keeping. But research from the nonprofit Electric Power Research Institute, along with separate analysis from Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory and the energy consulting firm the Brattle Group, found that data centers were not the primary driver of that broader trend. The bigger contributors in their analysis were things far less exciting to talk about. Utilities replacing genuinely aging infrastructure that was already due for costly upgrades, the price of natural gas swinging up and down, and recovery costs from wildfires and hurricanes that utilities are still passing on to ratepayers years later. In some regions, that research even found data centers exerting downward pressure on prices, because a big, steady new customer paying a lot of money can help spread a utility's fixed costs across a larger base. The same logic roughly as why a restaurant with more regular customers can sometimes charge each of them a little less. The honest resolution of these two findings isn't that one side is right and the other is wrong. It's that where you live changes which story is true for you. An energy economist who studies these markets described it with a useful image. Think of a utility system like a buffet with a fixed amount of food. If there's plenty of extra capacity sitting around, headroom, in the industry's word, a new, very large customer showing up doesn't take food out of anyone else's hands. There was enough to go around. But if the buffet is already close to running out and a new guest arrives and starts eating a lot very fast, there suddenly isn't enough left for everyone else and prices for what remains start to climb. That's a reasonably precise description of what's happening right now in the PJM region specifically. Demand has grown faster than new generation could be built to meet it, and the shortfall shows up as higher costs for everyone sharing that grid, tech company and household alike. There's a political fight brewing directly on top of this ambiguity, and it's worth understanding because it tells you where responsibility is likely to land next. In February 2026, a bipartisan pair of senators, one Republican, one Democrat, not a combination you see often on energy policy, introduced legislation they called the Grid Act, aimed squarely at severing the link between data center power demand and household bills. Its central mechanism is disarmingly simple: require data centers to secure and pay for their own dedicated power sources, separate from the shared grid that residential customers rely on, so that when a tech company needs a new power plant built to feed its servers, the company pays for that plant directly, rather than that cost getting folded into the shared rate base that every ratepayer in the region contributes to. One of the bill's sponsors put the underlying grievance about as plainly as it can be put. Families, in his words, should not be forced to bankroll big tech's electricity and infrastructure costs. Whether or not that specific bill becomes law, its existence tells you something important. Enough evidence has accumulated in enough places that lawmakers from both parties are now treating data centers might be quietly billing you not as a fringe suspicion, but as a legislative problem worth fixing. And electricity, it turns out, is only the first of the shared systems being strained. The other one is quieter, less visible on a monthly statement, and in some communities, considerably more alarming once people actually learn the numbers. Water doesn't show up on a monthly bill the way electricity does, which is part of why it took longer for the public to notice it. A household paying its water bill has no direct line of sight into how much water a data center 3 miles away is pulling from the same municipal system, or the same aquifer, or the same river. That opacity turns out to be a recurring pattern in this story. The costs that get noticed fastest are the ones that show up as a number you're handed. The costs that stay hidden longest are the ones that get absorbed by a shared, public resource nobody itemizes a bill for, at least not until the resource starts running short. Researchers studying the environmental footprint of these facilities have put rough numbers on what a single large data center can consume. As much power as roughly 2,000 homes and millions of gallons of water a year, some of it lost permanently to evaporation as part of the cooling process rather than returned to the local supply. When that demand lands on a water system that was engineered decades ago, for a town or county's ordinary residential and light industrial needs, the arithmetic can turn uncomfortable fast, especially in regions already dealing with drought stress or contaminated aquifers. Federal lawmakers have started treating this as a disclosure problem first, because right now, in a lot of places, the public genuinely doesn't know how much water a proposed data center will use until well after the deal to build it has already been signed. A bipartisan proposal from a Virginia senator, introduced in mid-2026, would tie a company's eligibility for certain state tax deferrals directly to whether it discloses its expected water and energy consumption up front, essentially using the tax code as leverage to force transparency that companies haven't been offering voluntarily. The senator's argument, as reported by local outlets, was blunt. Too many of these projects have moved forward with almost no public detail about the resources they'll actually draw on once running. By some counts, local opposition tied specifically to these unresolved resource questions had already blocked more than 75 proposed data center projects nationwide, together worth over $100 billion in just the first 3 months of 2026 alone. A sign that the disclosure gap isn't a minor irritation, it's actively determining which projects get built and which ones don't. Which brings us to the third piece of this puzzle, the one that ties electricity and water together into a single, older story about how American local government pays its bills: taxes. For most of the past decade, states didn't need much convincing to want data centers. They arrived offering the two things every local economic development official is trained to chase: large capital investment and new tax revenue, and in exchange, states offered generous exemptions, usually on sales tax for the equipment inside the buildings, sometimes on property tax as well. Loudoun County, Virginia, the same county at the center of the electricity story, now home to a genuinely staggering concentration of data center square footage, shows what that bargain can look like when it works in a jurisdiction's favor. Officials there expect real and personal property tax revenue from local data centers to approach $900 million in a single fiscal year, a sum nearly equal to the county's entire operating budget. That is not a small number, and it is not nothing. It funds schools, roads, emergency services, the ordinary machinery of local government at a scale that would be very hard to replace from any other single source. But that same research points to the trade-off underneath the windfall. The jobs these facilities create are concentrated overwhelmingly in construction, not in ongoing operations. Once the building is finished, running it doesn't take very many people, certainly nowhere near what the initial announcements sometimes implied. And a county whose budget has grown this dependent on a single, narrow, and genuinely unusual industry now faces a structural risk that didn't exist a decade ago. What happens to the school system's funding if the AI investment boom cools off, or shifts, or simply moves to the next state offering a better deal? Loudoun's own Board of Supervisors has openly discussed adjusting its tax structure specifically, because leaning this heavily on one industry has started to look less like a windfall and more like a vulnerability. That discomfort has been spreading fast, and in 2026 it turned into an unmistakable legislative trend. In just the first 6 weeks of this year's state legislative sessions, more than 300 separate data center-related bills were introduced across more than 30 states. A volume that itself marks a real shift, from states competing to offer incentives to states scrambling to add guardrails around ones they already gave away. According to the National Conference of State Legislatures, lawmakers in at least 28 states introduced proposals this year to meaningfully amend existing tax breaks, and at least 9 states have gone further, actively considering repealing their data center tax incentives outright. Arizona froze its incentive program for 3 years after public pushback over a proposed complex that would have paired 2 data centers with a new gas power plant. A freeze the governor's office estimated would save the state around $57 million, money Democratic lawmakers in the state argued could be better spent on things like childcare support. Michigan, Illinois, Oklahoma, and several others have moved on parallel tracks, from outright construction moratoriums while regulators study water and grid impacts, to new rules requiring data centers to pay electricity rates that actually reflect what they draw from the system, rather than rates negotiated under older, more generous terms. An economics professor at Ball State University who studies these deals put the underlying skepticism plainly. The promise of new jobs sounds attractive on a press release, but the real trade-offs, construction resources diverted away from other local priorities, energy costs pushed higher for everyone else on the grid, often go unmentioned in the announcement. It's a pattern showing up almost everywhere these facilities land. the benefits are announced loudly up front at a ribbon cutting. The costs get discovered later in a utility bill, in a water district's strained capacity report, in a county budget presentation nobody outside the community ever sees. Nowhere has that gap between announcement and consequence played out more starkly or more publicly than in a stretch of industrial land just south of Memphis, Tennessee, a place that has become, almost against its will, the clearest single case study of exactly what this national pattern looks like when it lands on one specific particular set of neighbors. In the summer of 2024, Memphis's Chamber of Commerce made an announcement it clearly expected to be celebrated. XAI, Elon Musk's artificial intelligence company, would build what it called the world's largest supercomputer cluster in the city, a facility eventually named Colossus. The pitch had all the familiar language: massive capital investment, hundreds of jobs, a flagship project putting Memphis on the map of the AI economy. What the announcement didn't include, because the company hadn't yet built it, was a functioning connection to enough grid power to actually run the thing. So XAI did something faster than waiting for new transmission capacity to come online through the ordinary regulatory process. It trucked in gas turbines, the same kind of equipment power plants use, but designed to be temporary, mobile, and installed quickly outside the normal permitting process that a permanent power plant would require. Reporting through 2025 and into 2026 traced the count of these turbines climbing steadily upward, from dozens acknowledged publicly, to a Reuters investigation in mid-2026 putting the number at 59, spread mostly across a site just over the state line in South Haven, Mississippi, alongside the original Memphis location. For much of that time, environmental groups say the turbines ran without the air quality permits that would ordinarily be required before a facility burns that much natural gas, that continuously, that close to people's homes. The neighborhood closest to the original site is called Boxtown, a historically black community in South Memphis that was already, before XAI ever arrived, surrounded by industrial polluters, a steel mill and oil refinery, a Tennessee Valley Authority gas plant among them. The area has failed to meet federal air quality standards for smog for years, and has received failing grades from the American Lung Association. Researchers at the University of Tennessee, asked by Time magazine to analyze satellite pollution data over the community, found that average nitrogen dioxide concentrations rose measurably in the period after the facility began operating compared with before. A local physician described the increase in peak pollution levels as alarming, noting that nitrogen dioxide specifically aggravates respiratory conditions like asthma, which was already elevated in the area before any of this began. Legal advocates representing the national NAACP have said residents in the closest neighborhoods already face cancer risk roughly 4 times the national average, a burden accumulated over decades from the industrial neighbors that came before XAI, now compounded, they argue, by a new one. XAI's own account of its presence in Memphis is not simply defensive. The company points to real, specific local investment. Millions of dollars in local taxes paid, hundreds of jobs created, and 2 infrastructure projects funded directly: a $35 million electrical substation and an $80 million water recycling facility, both built to support the local public utility rather than route around it. County health regulators, after months of dispute, granted the company permits in mid-2025 for 15 of its turbines. Permits that still allow substantial annual pollution on the order of dozens of tons each of smog-forming compounds, carbon monoxide and particulate matter, and nearly 10 tons of formaldehyde, a known carcinogen. Tracked under conditions the company itself is responsible for recording. That permit approval didn't end the conflict. By 2026, the Southern Environmental Law Center and Earthjustice, representing the NAACP, had filed federal litigation over turbines they say were still running without proper authorization. And the Department of Justice moved to have that suit dismissed on national security grounds, a legal argument that, if it succeeds, would make it considerably harder for any community anywhere to challenge an AI data center's environmental impact in court by invoking the strategic importance of the AI race itself. One elected official who has fought the project from the beginning, a Tennessee state representative, summed up the position of many residents in a single line: there's no amount of money that can persuade him to accept pollution killing his family. An older Boxtown resident watching the project expand described her own read on the pattern to Reuters more wearily. Once a company like this gets its foot in the door, she said, it doesn't tend to leave, and there's little an individual resident can do about that when the company involved has more money and more legal power than she does. It would be a mistake to read Memphis as proof that every data center produces this outcome, and it would be an equally serious mistake to read it as an unrelated anomaly. It's neither. It's the same underlying dynamic as the electricity bill in Loudoun County and the water disclosure fight in Virginia, just compressed into a more visible, more immediate, more physically dangerous form. In all three cases, a private company moved fast to secure a resource, grid capacity, water, or in Memphis's case, the ability to just generate its own power on-site rather than wait for the grid to catch up. And the systems meant to protect the public from the downstream cost of that speed were either too slow to keep up, too weak to say no, or, in the case of long-standing tax incentives, designed years ago by officials who never anticipated facilities of this scale showing up in their county at all. So who is really paying for America's AI data centers? Not the tech companies alone and not ordinary households alone. The honest answer is that the bill is being split but not evenly and not by anyone's clear or transparent design. The companies are paying unmistakably for the chips, the buildings, the engineers, the eye-watering capital costs of the AI race itself, some so large that comparing them to a household electric bill barely makes sense as a unit of measurement. But a meaningful share of what makes those buildings actually work, the new transmission lines, the strained water systems, the tax revenue a county forgoes for a decade in exchange for a promise. The air a Memphis neighborhood breathes has been getting paid for by people who never got a vote on whether the facility should be built at all, and in many documented cases, didn't even get told what it would cost them until after it arrived. What's changed, and changed quickly over the past year, is that this arrangement has stopped being invisible. 300 bills in 30 states in 6 weeks, a bipartisan bill in the U.S. Senate. A county reconsidering its own tax rate because it became too dependent on the industry it once courted. A federal lawsuit testing whether national security can shield a company from local environmental accountability. None of that happened because Washington or a state capital decided on principle that the balance needed correcting. It happened because enough people in Loudoun County, in South Memphis, in Arizona, in Michigan, opened a bill or looked at a well or breathed air that didn't used to smell like this, and started asking out loud the same question that started this story. Who exactly is this actually costing, and did anyone ever plan on telling us? That question doesn't have a single national answer yet. But for the first time since this building boom began, it's finally the question being asked in public by name in statehouses and courtrooms instead of just kitchen tables, and that, more than any specific rate case or lawsuit, may be the moment this story is actually about.